You're looking at the cover of a new book called Black Culture and the New Deal. The author of it, Lauren Rebecca Sklaroff, is with us here at the Organization of American Historians Convention in Washington, D.C. And you just told me off camera this is the first time you've had a chance to talk about this book except to your family, so tell me about it.
Absolutely. Well, Black Culture and the New Deal is a product of about a decade of research on the cultural programs of the Roosevelt administration during the 1930s and the 1940s and the ways in which they addressed racial issues of the period.
Well, let's start with President Roosevelt himself. Tell our viewers about his record overall on racial matters.
Well, I think that there's a sort of mixed idea about Franklin Roosevelt and his posture towards African Americans. I think on the one hand, in his heart, he was sympathetic towards issues of racial injustice, but on the other hand, the policies that he created and enforced had to be supported by a Southern contingent in Congress. And so real legislation, structural legislation that would have changed the political and economic lives of African Americans was never quite achieved. But on the other hand, Franklin Roosevelt and certainly his wife Eleanor were very, very conscious of a need to reach out to the African American community, to embrace them as new democratic voters, and to acknowledge that America had changed, certainly in terms of the polity and who made up the Democratic Party, and Eleanor Roosevelt in particular really took this on as a passion project, and a lot of Franklin's ideas came from the suggestions of his wife and her connections as well.
Well, perhaps the answer is mixed, but let me ask you then, on the part of the president himself, how much of his support and endorsement of these programs reaching out to African Americans was on moral and ethical grounds, and how much on pure political calculation?
Again, I think that much of what he did was politically calculated, but let's not forget that the individuals in his administration who were key to these programs, Harry Hopkins, Harold Ickes, Will Alexander, Hallie Flanagan, they were impassioned individuals who sought a new vision of interracial cooperation and who really tried to prevent racial injustice wherever they could in terms of what was in their purview. And these programs were created because of individuals who envisioned greater African American participation, but also greater African American visibility. The issue that representation was important and that stereotypes and discriminatory iconography needed to be obliterated. And that's what, in terms of the president's own interest, he was interested in these programs and certainly, came to some of the productions and met with some of the key directors. But the folks in his cabinet, his brain trust, and the folks that he appointed to become the heads of the WPA and the Secretary of the Interior and the folks who would really shepherd these projects were themselves longtime racial liberals who had a history of working with black political leaders. So much of this came from a longer history of interracial liberalism.
Before I leave that thought, explain why it was that they needed to entice or romance African American voters. What had historically been the...
Well, for a very long time, since emancipation, African Americans had supported the Republican Party and the party of Lincoln, of course, and most African Americans in the South by the end of the 19th century were disenfranchised, could not vote. In the North, they continued to vote Republican. But by the 1930s, certainly by the election of 1936, this had changed because African Americans were disenchanted with the party of Hoover, to become disenchanted, suffered the greatest brunt of the Depression, and saw incremental change and more positive action being taken on the part of the Democrats. So slowly they started to see that the Democratic Party was in fact a proponent of again, social justice, the Popular Front, bringing unionization, and all of these ideas kind of coalesced by 1935. And you see in the black press, a certain amount of skepticism. Should we really vote for Roosevelt? What has he really done for us? And some of the arguments back were, well, more than the Republican Party ever did. Sort of singling out, look, we have the appointment of a black cabinet. Look at Marion Bethune. Look at what some other, William Hasty. What other black individuals had achieved. And by the time that the programs I discussed were created, by 1935, again, you start to see much larger overtures towards African Americans. It's nothing compared to sort of contemporary life. It's nothing compared to the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s. But this is the first time that a president, that an administration reaches out to the African American community. And it's a necessity. It's a political necessity, and I think that, and also, there are certain ideas about discrimination that and sort of oppressing a certain part of the population that are becoming very unpopular. So
things are all moving at the same time.
Yeah, things are moving. In the 1930s, this period is a great awakening, in terms of American culture and in terms of thinking about who the real American is. And many people, liberal intellectuals, people who are really cultivating these programs, are thinking about imagining a new American citizenry that isn't just emulating Europe, that isn't just white men, that is, the first Americans, that is, these indigenous communities and African Americans and rural people, and there's a whole effort to sort of excavate the origins of American life.
So these programs developed during the Roosevelt administration, largely cultural, and reaching out to black intellectuals, black celebrities, and performers and the like. Tell us what was the umbrella under which the programs operated, and how did they work?
Okay. Well, the programs, the WPA, Work Progress Administration, was founded in 1935, and one aspect of it was white-collar relief. These were relief. The first part of the book, which talks about the programs of the 1930s, the Federal Theater Project and the Federal Writers Project, were part of what was called Federal One, which was a white-collar relief program for musicians, writers, authors, and stage employees, actors, etc. And part of the mission was to provide art for the masses, to actually, there was an ideology behind this. It wasn't just about putting dollars in people's pockets, although that was the first priority. But there was also the idea that most Americans had not yet seen a symphony, had never been to a major museum, had never seen a real work of art in person, that many American children had never had a real art class. And the idea that bringing this out into the hinterlands would sort of uplift America, sort of idea of a cultural democracy. That's what Harry Hopkins talked about. That's what some of Hallie Flanagan talked about, theater for the people. This idea of really trying to democratize culture. So with this in mind, these projects were formed with different units, and the focus in my book on the Federal Theater Project talks about the Negro units, the idea of having a separate black theater to cultivate black artistic talent, to employ playwrights and actors and stage employees, and to create performances for black audiences by black authors and playwrights.
And who were some of the names that we would recognize even till today that were beneficiaries of the programs?
Okay, well, in the Federal Theater Project, Clarence Muse, again, a lot of these folks are folks that deserve new biographies because these were more folks. Langston Hughes was in the Federal Writers Project, and trying to think of, again, one of my key figures, Carlton Moss, who served as a director of the New York Negro Unit and later served as an important figure on the documentary The Negro Soldier, is again a figure warranting more study. But these, in terms of the influence that they held in their time, had a resonance within the African American community and the white community as well for some.